Hi, Sleeping for Hours family. Before you sleep, please subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our nightly videos.
Close your eyes and sit with me on a South Philadelphia stoop at dusk. The air smells like tomato plants and hot pavement, and the city hums low, as if whispering secrets it's kept for decades. A man steps from the shadows, neat suit, careful steps, voice so soft you lean in to hear. People nod to him not because he shouts, but because he never needs to. He speaks in little pieces, and his quiet makes a room fall still. Some say he built peace. Others say he built silence, so you wouldn't hear the gears turning. He avoided fireworks, preferred the long game, and believed trouble came to those who invited it. This is the story of Angelo Bruno, called the Gentle Don by newspapers, a figure who kept his city calm on the surface while currents pulled beneath. What follows is not a fable. It's a patient walk through real streets and real choices, a life stitched from court files, newsrooms, and the memories of a neighborhood that watched him pass by with a nod. Let's talk about where he came from, what he did, who stood beside him, who stood against him, and how a quiet ruler shaped a noisy place without turning this into a lesson on how to do harm, because none of that deserves any staging. This is history, told plainly, with care. Angelo Bruno entered the world in 1910 as Angelo Annaloro, born in the Sicilian town of Villalba. Like many families from that island, his people knew about tight money and long days. They crossed the ocean for work and landed in Philadelphia, settling among others who spoke with the same music in their voices. South Philly was a patchwork of stoops, churches, grocers, barbers, and small shops, where news traveled faster than the trolley. In that landscape, boys grew up quick. They learned how to chip ice, carry crates, and keep their heads down. Angelo learned English at school, and learned the city from the older men who watched corners and remembered everything. He did not come from fame. He built his name by moving carefully and listening more than he spoke. Even as a teenager, he had the habit of pausing before he answered. Work came first. He helped in shops, made deliveries, and met people who could open doors. He married young and kept a steady home, the kind with a pot always on and a rule that family stayed out of certain conversations. He would later be known for a clean suit and a measured walk, but in the beginning there were long sleeves rolled up and calluses. In a city where many scrambled to get by, the line between legal hustle and illegal hustle blurred for more than a few. Angelo's path crossed with figures who did both. Prohibition, which turned liquor into contraband and small-time runners into rich men, had set the stage in the 1920s. Angelo came of age as that era faded, but its habits lingered. People who had learned to move product out of sight now moved other things. Bets, numbers, slips, loan books, boxes of goods that fell off trucks. Angelo found his lane around those trades. According to investigators and later testimony, he aligned with a Sicilian-led organization that took root under an early Philadelphia boss named Salvatore Sabella. The point here isn't to glorify any of it. The point is to track how a quiet young man with a talent for order rose in an underworld that valued silence. The early rackets around him were familiar to cities everywhere. There was bookmaking, the taking of bets on horse races, ball games, fights. There were numbers, a neighborhood lottery that locals played for small hits that felt big in hard times. There was high-interest lending to people and small businesses who couldn't walk into a bank and get a line of credit. There were protection payments collected from club owners and shopkeepers who didn't want trouble. There were also legitimate businesses, bars, restaurants, vending routes, real estate parcels, ice companies, food distribution. These could be honest on their own, or they could act as a screen. Angelo learned to keep both sides running clean enough that police attention, when it came, found little on the surface. Those who watched him closely noticed a few patterns early. He did not like spectacle. He understood that noise brings unwanted eyes, and unwanted eyes bring subpoenas. He preferred deals to threats, and when people around him wanted to make a point the loud way, he slowed them down. That trait, more than anything, would define his era later. But it began here. He also learned the importance of alliances beyond Philadelphia. New York, just up the turnpike, held the seat of a broader national structure. Men who rose high in Philadelphia usually did so with a nod from men in Manhattan or Brooklyn. Angelo visited often, kept his voice low, and built relationships that would matter. By the mid-1930s and into the 1940s, Philadelphia's leadership changed hands. Sabella retired. John Avina took the chair and was later lost to violence. Joseph Dovey, then Joseph Ida, ran the family at different times. Angelo kept his circle tight. He built influence without flashing it, expanding gambling routes, attaching himself to union contacts who could guide contracts for trucking, construction, and docks. Sources from law enforcement later tied him to the control of coin-operated machines, jukeboxes, cigarette dispensers, pinball, and later amusement devices that sat in diners and bars across the city and its suburbs. The money wasn't quick and dramatic. It was steady, which he liked, and it was easier to count if the city stayed calm. When the 1950s arrived, the national picture changed. A broad alliance known as the Commission, made up of leaders from major American cities, sought to keep disputes contained and profits organized. New York families, with their numbers and reach, heavily influenced decisions. In 1957, police broke up a high-level gathering in Appalachian, New York, bringing sudden heat on figures from many cities. Philadelphia's boss, Joseph Ida, faced pressure and left for Italy, and an acting arrangement put Dominic Polina in place. In that shakeup, old grudges surfaced. Accounts later gathered by agents and informants say Polina viewed Angelo's growing influence as a threat and floated the worst kind of remedy: remove him. A veteran named Ignazio Denaro, who would have been tasked with carrying out such a plan, reportedly told Angelo instead. It was a crossroads. Angelo did not rant or rally. He traveled north, consulted powerful allies, including friends aligned with Carlo Gambino in New York, and asked for a clean decision. The commission favored stability, and Angelo offered exactly that. He wasn't a bomber, he wasn't greedy in a way that made others lose sleep, and he had a gift for keeping his area quiet. In 1959, he was recognized as the head of the Philadelphia family. Polina stepped aside. There were no fireworks. South Philly mostly looked the same. But a new code settled over the city: make money, avoid headlines, and keep the peace. Angelo's word became policy. People later called him the Gentle Don, a label built less on kindness than on strategy. He preferred to meet in kitchens or out-of-the-way rooms and settle disputes before they turned messy. He liked to say that a man should go home at night. He pushed his people to focus on gambling, loans, and union leverage earnings that, while clearly criminal, drew less public outcry than headline-grabbing brutality. He discouraged drug trafficking in his territory, a stance retold often by agents and reporters. Some who disagreed later argued that he allowed certain channels to operate so long as they paid a tax elsewhere, which bred resentment. Whatever the full truth, the rule he promoted in public was simple: don't bring that trade into his house. It's important to state this plainly. Any such trade harms communities, and nothing here is praise. We're describing how he set policy because that choice shaped both his support and his opposition. As boss, he divided the city and surrounding counties into crews run by captains he trusted. These captains oversaw bookmakers, numbers writers, loan collectors, and anyone handling machines or routes. They also kept the peace among associates, mediating disputes over who controlled which bar, which corner, which labor local, which private club. If two men argued, they brought it to their captain, who brought it up the ladder. Angelo preferred that problems arrive at his table before they spilled into the street. This was not a soft world, but under him the public saw less open chaos. His ties with New York grew warmer. He visited Carlo Gambino, a man whose approach was not unlike his own: measured, discreet, allergic to scenes. That friendship mattered when boundary lines needed drawing between Philadelphia and North Jersey, or when someone from another city tried to plant a flag in South Jersey's expanding suburbs. Angelo also kept connections with figures in the Genovese family across the river, people who had sway over unions and businesses that crossed state lines. These alliances helped him maintain a balance. He paid respect. They returned it. Investigations followed him all the same. Grand juries asked questions. Reporters watched his house. He was placed under surveillance coming in and out of clubhouses and quiet restaurants. He faced charges at different points, including contempt citations for refusing to answer grand jury questions. Still, he avoided long stints in prison. Part of that came from how he ran things. He stayed removed from day-to-day action, rarely signed his name to anything risky, and kept his conversations gentle and vague. Agents wired places they thought he might use but often heard nothing usable. He would discuss weather, children, and neighborhood gossip until the microphones turned stale. When he did talk business, it was in short phrases and nicknames, almost impossible to decode. All along, money flowed from familiar sources. Gambling dens booked action from sports, gamblers who called in bets to numbers that stretched past city limits. Shylock loans went out to small business owners who were behind on inventory, or to people who liked card games too much. Some paid back easily, others needed persuasion, the kind that didn't make the news but got the message across. Angelo expected collectors to be firm and to leave as little trace as possible. He repeated an old principle: problems should be handled before they become scandals. That meant sheepish knock-and-talks, not dramatic scenes. Again, none of this is endorsement. It's a ledger of what investigators attributed to the organization he led. Legitimate fronts filled gaps and gave cover. Vending companies placed machines in diners across Delaware County and Camden. Food distribution outfits moved goods into restaurants. There were property holdings, row houses, storefronts, small warehouses that paid rent on time. In later years, as Atlantic City moved toward legal casinos, those holdings and relationships in South Jersey would become even more important. But in the first years of his rule, the aim was simple: keep Philadelphia quiet, keep the dollars steady, and keep the attention somewhere else. Rumors grew inside his circle that he forced hotheads to take assignments far from the core. One name that came up was Nicodemo Scarfo, an ambitious man with a reputation for trouble. Instead of letting him mix inside South Philly, Angelo is said to have encouraged him to work in Atlantic City, which at the time was faded, not yet the neon draw it would become. The point was to maintain order at home. Ambitious men do not stay content when sidelined, and such choices plant seeds. At this stage, though, Angelo's approach worked. Street corners felt safer. Newspapers had fewer sensational headlines from the city's Italian neighborhoods. Older residents remember walking past his house and seeing him on the steps, nodding hello, always polite, never rushed. None of this means federal interest faded. Senate hearings on organized crime aired coast to coast. Philadelphia's name came up often. Angelo was cast as a refined counterpart to louder figures elsewhere. He disappointed agents who expected dramatics. He drove himself sometimes, carried himself like a neighborly uncle, and kept his voice at the same level in every conversation. That image, orderly, understated, earned him the label that would stick. But the label ignores the harm beneath the manners. The illegal loans that trapped people, the payoffs that distorted contracts, the intimidation that silenced those who wanted out, the tax-free cash that undermined honest businesses. His success lay in making those harms look like background noise. Through the early 1960s, he notched wins that mattered inside his world. He settled disputes without public fights. He brokered understandings with nearby families about who controlled which edges of South Jersey. He expanded the reach of gambling without opening flashy rooms that would invite raids. He built a structure in which money moved up without loud arguments. Captains who met their quotas were left to manage their corners. Captains who didn't were replaced quietly. Law enforcement mapped the tree, but struggled to shake it. This first stretch of Angelo Bruno's reign is best understood as a long, calm inhale after a decade of upheaval. Earlier bosses had faced raids, shootouts, and sudden deaths. The man now at the center saw those outcomes as failure. He wanted longevity. He wanted routine. To get it, he set rules designed to keep the city's underworld out of the spotlight, and keep families his own, and those of the men who worked for him out of mourning clothes. Whether that made him merciful or simply careful depends on who tells the story. Either way, it bought him 2 decades at the top. He did not pretend to be a saint. He just refused to be a spectacle. That is why older Philadelphians still remember his walk. Slow, with hands folded at his front or tucked in his coat, eyes scanning faces like a teacher noting attendance. He had the gift of making people feel seen. That skill helps in any trade, even one that shouldn't exist. When trouble flared among his own men over a gambling rout, a lone customer, a labor local, he let everyone speak. Then he decided. The aim was not fairness, as most people think of it. The aim was stability. A structure breaks when too many feel squeezed. Angelo knew how to ease pressure without losing control. By the end of the 1950s, the city had a new kind of boss, one who dressed plain, ate simple meals, and cultivated an image of neighborly calm while directing a network that reached into betting parlors, union halls, and business offices across 2 states. He didn't use a grand office. He used back rooms and remembered faces. He kept his books in other people's heads and hands. He trusted few with the full map and favored those who didn't brag. That practice insulated him when men in suits and badges came knocking. There is a basic truth about a calm surface. It hides currents. A policy against drug dealing in his house created tension with those who saw the quick money it brought in other cities. A practice of sidelining brash men created pockets of resentment. A gentle tone from the top encouraged some to mistake softness for weakness. None of those threads snapped in these first years. They simply tightened. In time, Atlantic City would legalize casino gambling. New York allies would die or be imprisoned, and the balance that kept Philadelphia quiet would tilt. All of that belongs to the next chapters. For now, hold a picture of a man stepping off a South Philly stoop at dawn, pausing at the curb to smooth the front of his coat, and getting into a car with a driver who knows every stop. It's the early 1960s. The city is waking. He prefers mornings, when the streets are clear and the work ahead fits on a list that only he carries. He believes that if he keeps everything orderly enough, nothing will break. Even the best planners forget that people aren't ledgers. The early 1960s in Philadelphia moved to a quiet rhythm that fit him. He liked first light, an empty street, a slow coffee, and a day arranged in his head before anyone else was awake. He met people in kitchens and corner booths, not because he feared noise, but because he didn't need it. The men who worked under him learned the rule he leaned on most. Calm wins. The city's corners were valuable only if they stayed ordinary to everyone else. So the gambling books stayed steady, the numbers slips moved by hand, the loans went out and came back with interest, and the machines in diners clicked quarters into neat stacks. It was a system built on the idea that predictable money attracts less trouble than fast fireworks. He made money in places where crowds already gathered. A bar with a jukebox and a cigarette machine paid a small fee for the privilege of keeping both on site. A grill with a pinball cabinet in the back offered something to do while you waited for a sandwich. A club with a small back room saw card games on slow nights. These were familiar scenes in any city, and they were easier to defend in the face of police questions than a raw backroom of flashing cash. Alongside that, bet takers wrote down action on fights and ball games, and small neighborhood lotteries paid out just enough to keep the line long. None of it was benign. It pulled in people who could least afford it, and tilted business for those who wanted to stay clean. But it stayed quiet, which was his intent. He showed an instinct for dividing responsibility in a way that reduced friction. Crews ran out of South Philly, the river wards, the Northeast, Camden, and pockets of South Jersey. Each crew chief kept a ledger of who ran books, who collected, who watched the union local that touched their area, and who could solve small disputes before they climbed the ladder. He expected updates, but not drama. He wanted numbers that added up and a city that didn't buzz with rumors of beefs. If 2 men tangled over a corner or a route, the matter moved up to a captain, then to him, in a kitchen or a back office, where voices stayed level and the answer stuck. His ties beyond the city limits thickened. New York remained the center of gravity for the larger world he inhabited. He made regular trips, kept faith with old friends who valued order the way he did, and returned home with understandings that prevented costly border fights. To the west, he kept an eye on Reading and the coal towns. To the south, he nurtured relationships in Delaware. Across the river, he worked to treat Camden and the shore as part of his house. This reach did not come from public declarations. It grew from quiet handshakes, respect shown at the right times, and a reputation for paying his way and keeping his men from making a mess. Law enforcement watched that reputation with interest and frustration. Grand juries called him in. Reporters camped outside restaurants he was known to like. He presented as a neighbor with tidy habits. He said little. He took contempt charges when he needed to. He paid fines. Long prison time never stuck to him in those years. Agents learned that if a room might hold a microphone, conversations in that room turned to weather, families, or sports. He preferred to save substantive talk for moments that left no record and no audience. It wasn't mystique. It was discipline, learned over decades. Investigators wrote reports noting how little slipped, even as they mapped the structure that surrounded him. Union influence deepened his reach. Dock work, trucking, warehouses, construction, and service jobs all sat near cash flow and contracts. People tied to his circle found positions where they could sway job calls, steer vendor lists, influence which crews showed up at which sites, and keep an eye on dues money. When disputes arose between contractors and labor, a quiet visitor sometimes helped both sides find a path. Those paths rarely favored outsiders. Court records and investigative files later linked his people to locals in building trades, bartenders' unions, trucking outfits, and the waterfront. That kind of leverage brought steady income and control over who got work, and it put pressure on businesses to play along. He drew clear lines and expected everyone beneath him to obey. He discouraged drug trafficking in his territory, a choice he framed as protection for the neighborhood and insurance against heavy heat. Men who wanted that money were told to take it elsewhere, or not at all. Stories from former associates and agents differ on how strictly the line held, but the rule as stated from his chair was simple: don't bring that business into his streets. That helped keep public outrage tamped down and reduce the kind of attention that follows overdose spikes and turf fights. At the same time, it bred resentment among those who watched other cities grow richer off a trade he rejected. Some men were moved out of the Corps because of temperament. Ambition without restraint made him uneasy. He sent one hard charger to Atlantic City long before Neon returned to that boardwalk, another to the far edges of South Jersey, and told a third to keep to Delaware County. The message was always polite: build something there. Not everyone heard the subtext. Those who did felt managed. Those who didn't believe they were being groomed. In truth, he was protecting the center, and the center sat in narrow streets where people knew his face and his habits and, just as important, felt they knew the rules. The national spotlight on organized crime widened in the 1960s. Televised hearings introduced people to faces and names. Investigations in New York rippled outward. Informants from other cities tried to trade knowledge for leniency, and his name came up as a man who kept his city off the front page. The label the press gave him, Gentle Don, took root. It sounded flattering, but it blurred reality. The model he enforced still involved taking money that didn't belong to him, lending at painful rates, and scaring off anyone who wanted to run independent. It also relied on payoffs to public employees who were supposed to protect the public. He understood the math of influence and used it. With the 1960s rolling on, he made a habit of easing tensions before they turned into crises. A captain who fell behind on payments got a talk, then a temporary partner to help fix the route, not a public shaming. A bookmaker who grew brave and tried to skip tribute was visited by men who spoke quietly but made the point. A union officer who forgot which contractor the local preferred remembered after a calm sit-down with a reminder of past favors. His model was a series of nudges that didn't leave marks on the nightly news. This was control by routine, not by spectacle. He kept relationships with older community figures, parish priests, shop owners, neighborhood coaches, because they stood near the soul of a block. He made donations without ceremony. He showed up at funerals, weddings, and school fundraisers. He waved from his stoop. That public courtesy made him seem like any other man who had made good. It masked the costs that came with his order. People paid twice, once to the city in taxes, once in envelopes that quietly crossed tables. Small businesses that wanted to stay independent felt pressure to accept vending routes they didn't seek or to hire men they didn't choose. Many shrugged and called it the price of doing business. That shrug is part of how such systems last. He also built a bridge to legal businesses that needed things smoothed out. A restaurant that wanted extra space to set tables in a permitted area needed the right city inspector to nod. A trucking company that needed turnaround at the docks had to avoid sudden delays on the pier. A contractor eager to win a bid needed a labor environment free of surprises. A lawyer down the block knew whom to call. The calls led back to him or one of his lieutenants. For a cut, problems thinned out. That exchange felt almost normal to those who grew up under it. Normal is a powerful shield. The mid-1960s brought internal shifts. Trusted elders aged out. Younger earners climbed. He kept a seasoned counselor close. The same man many believe warned him years earlier, When a previous leader considered removing him, that counselor helped him gauge which up-and-comers understood the rules and which saw rules as obstacles. A few names became fixtures around him, men who would matter even more later. A poised captain who kept South Philly running like a clock, a sharp underboss who handled North Jersey and Trenton interests, and a blunt enforcer whose name sparked worry even when he was miles away in a shore town. Together they formed the ring that kept his decisions in motion. He watched change on the horizon across the river. Atlantic City, long past its prime, debated legal casino gambling. He tracked hearings, read proposals, and asked questions through intermediaries. He pictured construction contracts, vendor lists, union charters, supply chains, and service jobs, all the places where influence could be applied without fanfare. If those casinos came, outsiders would want a piece. He aimed to make sure any piece in his backyard involved him. He didn't dream of running tables. He thought about who served drinks, who hauled trash, who fixed machines, who filled vending racks, who transported cash, and who kept order in loading bays. He prepared for a future where everything looked legitimate from the sidewalk. In the later 1960s, he faced the usual pressure of a man at the top of a structure spread across counties. Enforcement stepped up at times, launching raids on gambling rooms and initiating tax cases. He collected fines as a cost of business. He answered subpoenas with silence. He leaned on lawyers who understood the thin lines between presence and proof. Once in a while, an associate flipped, and stories leaked about the internal map, which captain controlled which neighborhood, how money moved, who attended Thursday lunches. Those stories rarely came with documents strong enough to break the center. Patience and distance protected him. He also tended to the politics within his world. Boundaries with other families needed constant attention. North Jersey, especially Newark and the surrounding towns, was contested space where Philadelphia interests brushed against New York's longest arms. He paid respect to neighbors, kept meetings rhythmical, and tried to keep his own men from freelancing across lines that would spark costly reactions. When men under him argued about who could tax which route, he called for paperwork and witnesses and settled it by his own code. Not everyone left happy. Everyone left clear. By the end of the decade, he had turned a volatile organization into a machine that, while illegal, functioned with fewer public incidents than in the eras before him. Money moved up, trouble moved sideways, and anger flowed downward in measured amounts. He built this by rewarding patience and suffocating attention-seeking. That design made his city appear calmer than others, where headlines blared weekly. It also bred a particular kind of jealousy. Men who wanted faster gains or bigger slices watched the man at the top distribute opportunities to those who mirrored his restraint. Their grudges would matter later. The 1970s began with that same surface calm, but the ground underneath had new cracks. The national picture shifted as agencies grew more coordinated, laws sharpened, and prosecutors tested wider racketeering strategies. Investigations came bundled. Instead of isolated gambling charges, cases now tried to tell full stories. Extortion here, bribery there, unlawful debt collection over there, all tied together by a conspiracy count. He adjusted by leaning even harder into distance. He spoke in generalities, kept paperwork far from his person, and left day-to-day tasks to men a layer or two removed. This period also revealed the limits of his ban on certain trades. Younger earners saw friends in other cities cash in on narcotics money and felt constrained. They built arguments dressed as business plans. He kept saying no. Some tried to skirt the rule with side arrangements, funneling profit through other channels and pretending the source was clean. Those games angered him when they came to light. He didn't explode. He cut people off from privileges, reassigned routes, or moved them out of his way. That kept the core clean and deepened the resentment of those shut out. Names that would later sit at the center of drama grew larger in this decade. A North Jersey figure with a gift for collecting found himself trusted and resented in equal measure. A South Philly captain known for real estate deals and a habit of fixing problems with a single phone call became essential at the table. A shore-based operator kept reaching toward the bigger stage and kept getting told to wait his turn. A veteran driver and aide, loyal and present, saw more of his boss's days than almost anyone else. These men, and others like them, ran his map while he maintained the idea that every decision flowed back to him like a quiet stream. Lawful opportunities began to bloom in South Jersey after voters approved casino gambling late in the decade. Licenses, permits, construction contracts, hotel supplies, food service, uniforms, machine repair, waste removal, security staffing, the list of vendors multiplied. He moved early to attach trusted people to the edges of that new economy. They didn't aim to sit behind the green felt. They aimed to supply the suppliers, a layer removed but close enough to feel the heat of the money. He encouraged partnerships that placed his associates just outside the spotlight, yet within reach of regular, accountable revenue. If a union needed to be calm during a build, someone he knew helped it stay calm. If a hotel needed an army of linens each week, a company connected to his world got the call. Federal and state attention turned harder toward Atlantic City at the same time. Background checks, licensing boards, gaming commissions, and task forces braided together. His organization had to move like a man threading a needle in bright light. Interviews with regulators demanded clean records. He favored longtime associates who kept a low profile and encouraged them to stand on legitimate legs wherever possible. He didn't want scandals that would make newspapers or jeopardize the new stream. This approach suited his nature. It also forced certain men to cool their expectations, which they didn't forget. He continued to avoid big trials that threatened to remove him for years. He did face legal trouble, contempt counts, hearings, the usual cycle of subpoenas and refusals, but full racketeering cases did not knock him off his chair in this era. Part of that came from timing. Part from the loyalty of people closest to him. Part from his habit of never saying more than necessary. When he did speak in public, he stuck to neighborly topics, the weather, or how the Eagles looked on Sunday. Reporters complained that his quotes were boring. That suited him fine. Through it all, he never left the rituals that put him at ease. He liked his stoop, his coffee shops, his simple meals, his family dinners. He dressed with care but not flash. He walked the same blocks he had walked for decades and remembered names. He greeted children and asked about school. People who knew only that side of him insisted he was just a quiet success story from the neighborhood. People who saw both sides understood that the courtesy came with a cost paid by others. Both views lived on the same street without bumping into each other. By the late 1970s, the balance began to tilt. National allies he relied on aged and passed their chairs to successors with different ideas. Carlo Gambino, whose friendship had long protected him, died. New York's internal shifts produced new pressures along the Hudson and in North Jersey. Younger men in his world had waited a long time for their turn. The casino rush in Atlantic City brought fresh faces with wild expectations and old faces with growing appetites. Every one of those changes pulled at the fabric he had woven. He tried to pull it tight the way he always had. Sit down, talk it out, keep the streets calm. For the first time since he took the wheel, that wasn't enough to settle the room. He still believed in the same rule: keep the city quiet. And he held to it even as complaints rose that he was too cautious, too stingy, too fond of routine. Some argued that his ban on certain trades starved the family while others enriched themselves. Others resented how he shared opportunities in Atlantic City, seeing favoritism where he saw prudence. A few took their frustrations outside, murmuring to neighbors across the river, testing old boundaries. He heard about those murmurs. He measured responses. He issued reminders. He trusted that the system he built, with its steady earnings and low drama, would weather this too. Those currents: resentment over new money, the loss of old allies, the hunger of men who felt sidelined, were the central facts of his later years. He could still walk his block with the easy nod that made him feel secure. He could still keep weekly gatherings dull enough to bore anyone looking for quotes. He could still point to a city mostly free of loud headlines about his circle. Yet the quiet he maintained on the surface hid louder conversations in back rooms he didn't occupy. The same restraint that had brought him 2 decades at the top now looked, to certain men, like a wall in their path. He did not change his nature. He stayed patient, stayed polite, stayed convinced that slow money beats fast trouble. He continued to tell men to go home at night. He expected the wisdom of experience to carry the day, and for a while longer, it did. People still played numbers. Machines still took quarters. Loans still went out and came back with interest. Union locals still had preferred contractors. Restaurants still served sandwiches under jukeboxes he placed there years ago. The city still woke to the same sounds. But the era that had allowed one man to keep such a broad map calm was ending, because the men around him were no longer satisfied with calm. Atlantic City lit up again, and with that glow came decisions that pressed on old habits. He had watched the long debate from a distance, sure that legalized casinos would draw money and oversight in equal measure. When the first gaming floor opened in 1978, he treated it like a factory with new supply lines rather than a carnival. He didn't want to run dice or hold a seat at a table. He wanted the pieces around the edges: laundry contracts, food delivery, waste hauling, uniforms, machine maintenance, cash transit, security on loading docks, union comm at construction sites. Those lanes allowed steady income without standing under spotlights. He placed reliable people in positions where they could be hired by real companies, paid on the books, and answer questions from regulators without tripping alarms. It was influenced by proximity, not ownership. This approach pleased older allies and irritated men who craved bigger, faster wins. The same restraint he had preached since the 1950s now felt, to some, like a lid. Younger earners compared their cut to stories from New York and Miami and wanted more. The most vocal frustration came from the north side of his map, in Newark, Trenton, and the surrounding towns, where a seasoned operator named Antonio Caponegro had long-run collections and gambling. Caponegro, known for a hard edge that never softened, handled tribute from North Jersey and expected respect for the numbers he delivered. He wanted greater freedom and a larger share, and he disliked being told no when the new shore money began to flow. The two men could not have been more different in temperament. Angelo kept balance by easing conflict. Caponegro pushed through it. Law enforcement later identified Caponegro as consigliere, the counselor's seat once held by a trusted elder who prized quiet. Whether the title changed formally or simply in practice, the contrast mattered. As casino vendors met with licensing boards and answered background checks, he stressed that any man attached to those contracts needed to present clean files. Caponegro saw that caution as old-fashioned and slow. He believed the new economy called for muscle and bold moves. The tension remained inside rooms for a time, but men around them heard it and took sides. Investigators and journalists also noted growing friction over narcotics. He had drawn a line early in his rule, telling his circle to leave that trade out of his streets. Stories rose that some in his orbit skirted that rule by working deals in other cities or by using intermediaries. Various accounts claimed he tolerated small, distant operations if tribute arrived reliably and trouble stayed elsewhere. Others insisted he held firm and punished men who crossed him. Those accounts cannot be reconciled cleanly now. What is clear is that the appearance of a double standard rules for most, exceptions for a few stirred anger. Caponegro and others in North Jersey believed they brought in money while being lectured about methods by men who didn't risk the same heat. New York's internal changes deepened the strain. Carlo Gambino, a protector and like-minded friend, died in 1976. His circle, now guided by Paul Castellano, still preferred business over spectacle. But the personal bond that had benefited Philadelphia was gone. On the Genovese side, Frank Thierry rose in influence. Law enforcement later alleged that Caponegro sought Thierry's blessing to resolve his feud with his boss by force. Accounts differ about what exactly Thierry said. Some sources claim Thierry hinted at approval without securing the broader council's consent. Others suggest he simply listened and let Caponegro hear what he wanted to hear. What matters is that Caponegro left those conversations believing he had cover to act. That belief set events in motion that would end a long reign and reshape the city. During these same months, official attention on Atlantic City tightened. New Jersey's State Commission of Investigation probed how organized figures might try to reach into casinos and vendors. Regulatory staff ran background checks and asked detailed questions about ownership and prior associations. He responded in his old way. Send in people with unobtrusive records, keep layers between himself and any contract, and avoid direct involvement that could be shown on paper. He sat for subpoenas when required, invoked his rights, accepted contempt findings when they came, and kept his schedule otherwise unchanged. Reporters complained that every public appearance yielded no quotes. That was the point. The less he said, the weaker the cases built around his words. Inside the family, he maintained the same map he'd drawn years earlier. Captains oversaw South Philly, the river wards, Delaware County, Camden, and North Jersey. Those captains handled bookmakers, numbers writers, loan collectors, vending routes, and union relationships. Money moved up on a timetable. He set targets without bluster. If a crew missed, he sent help before he sent punishment. He valued composure, and he separated men with a taste for drama from the core. One of those men, Nicodemo Scarfo, stayed in Atlantic City, kept far from central decisions, and grew restless. Another, a smooth and dependable driver named John Stanfa, stayed close and handled errands, a presence that made many days run on time. By late 1979, the air in the rooms he ran felt different. He still heard respect in voices, still saw heads dip when he walked into kitchens, but whispers had grown sharper. Some elders urged caution, others called for adjustments, share more from Atlantic City, reconsider the drug policy, bring North Jersey's leaders closer to the center. He listened, nodded, and stuck to the model that had protected the city for 2 decades. Routine is power. Quiet is safety. Order keeps families from grief. He believed time would calm egos as it always had. Caponegro did not calm. He built a coalition with a few men who saw the same chance he saw. Remove the man at the top, reshape the money map, speed up the pace. Among those men were figures in North Jersey and South Philly who handled serious lanes, bookmaking, collections, and the new shore routes. Their talks happened in side rooms and private houses, not in the usual haunts where word might travel. The plan they reached for required more than bravado. Removing a long-sitting leader risked a reaction from New York. Caponegro believed he had cover, or at least a path to argue for forgiveness after the fact. History suggests he misread his position, and that misreading would swallow him soon after he moved. On a cool night in March 1980, he ended his day the way he liked to end many days. Quiet meal. A calm ride home. No parade of cars. No noisy entourage. He settled into the front passenger seat of his sedan outside his South Philadelphia house. His driver, Stanfa, held the wheel. The block looked like any other night on that street. Porches, lights inside row houses, a city exhaling at the end of a work week. In a sudden burst, the calm he had built for 20 years broke. A brief, violent moment ended his life. Neighbors stepped onto stoops in shock as sirens converged. The man who prided himself on avoiding spectacle became the center of a scene he had always prevented. News spread before midnight. Morning papers ran his photo next to words that had followed him for years. Gentle Dawn. The city spoke in low tones about the end of an era. Those who liked the order he kept worried about what would come next. Those who had chafed under his slow pace wondered how quickly the map might be redrawn. Police and federal agents began the ritual they knew well. Cordon the scene, gather fragments, interview anyone with a link, watch hospitals, watch airports, listen for tips. Publicly, questions outnumbered answers. Inside his world, the answers were clearer. People knew which resentments had boiled all year. They knew who stood to benefit. They also knew that no one could claim the chair without answering to New York. In the days that followed, emissaries traveled. Men from Philadelphia and North Jersey went to New York to explain, deny, or ask forgiveness, depending on their role and courage. A simple principle guided the response from the National Council. A killing at that level needed approval, and no one had it. The man believed to be the architect of the plot, Antonio Caponegro, soon paid the price. Within weeks, he disappeared from his usual haunts. He was found dead in New York, a punishment meant to deliver a message to anyone tempted to claim authority without permission. His close associate and relative by marriage, Alfred Salerno, met the same fate. Other suspected participants, including respected veteran John "Johnny" Keys Simone, were eliminated in later months. No court carried the message. The system policed itself in the way it always had, without announcements. Inside Philadelphia, stability demanded an heir. The obvious candidate was Philip Testa, a senior figure who had stood near Angelo for years and understood the rules that had kept the streets calm. He stepped into the role with a promise to keep the old model going, focus on gambling and loans, keep the new casino lanes tidy, continue to draw a firm line on narcotics, and avoid the kind of noise that draws TV cameras. For a short while, it worked. Captains reported in, tribute moved as before, and the city registered the change only as a shift in names, not in daily rhythms. That short calm hid new fractures. While Caponegro had been punished, the grievances that fed his move had not gone away. Some men still believed they deserved more from Atlantic City. Others wanted the ban on drug profit lifted or revised. A few, especially those sent away from the center during Angelo's era, saw a chance to come back with new weight. Meanwhile, law enforcement rebuilt cases with the sharper tools of the time. The federal racketeering law, on the books since 1970, began to carry teeth in courtrooms. Prosecutors, who for years had knocked down small pieces of the tree without touching the trunk, now tried to show a full picture: extortion, illegal gambling, loan sharking, and bribery tied together through a continuing enterprise. The goal wasn't a fine. It was long prison time for multiple figures connected through a single narrative. Angelo's death gave those efforts urgency. Task forces formed with staff from city police, the FBI, IRS, postal inspectors, and state agencies. They mapped the family as he had run it, who handled South Philly, who managed the numbers in Camden, which crew took care of the jukebox and cigarette routes, which union locals had officers friendly to the old regime, which companies in Atlantic City had quiet ties to his associates. They revisited cold files, old contempt citations, tax questions, surveillance logs that once seemed thin. They paired those files with fresh wiretaps and new informants. Men who had enjoyed 2 quiet decades now found microphones where they had once enjoyed privacy. On the street, people remembered him the way they had known him: a courteous neighbor who tipped well, showed up at funerals, and never forgot a name. That public face made some residents think of his passing as the end of a protective layer. Others, especially those who had paid into the system or lived with the fear that came with defying it, saw a chance for something better. Both feelings lived in South Philly that spring. The man himself had carefully kept a wall between those two versions of his life. With him gone, the wall fell, and the conflict between the memories grew more visible. The list of activities tied to his tenure filled investigative memos: sports betting, neighborhood numbers, card rooms behind private doors, high-interest loans to gamblers and small businesses, insurance for club owners who wanted to avoid trouble, skims from vending routes, influence over construction sites through labor contacts, sway in dock work and trucking, pressure on public employees who controlled permits and inspections, and, later, footholds in the supply chains that fed Atlantic City hotels and casinos. Court records from the era showed individual cases, bookmakers convicted on state charges, union officers sanctioned for corruption, shop owners arrested for keeping illegal machines, but the central figure stayed out of long prison terms. His method had insulated him. He did not explain moves on phones. He did not sign contracts. He did not let anyone keep ledgers near his chair. He answered questions with courtesies, not details. His murder, like many events in that world, ended a body and began a legend. The nickname newspapers liked, Gentle Don, spread more widely than before. It made him sound like a benevolent uncle, rather than a man who enforced an illegal tax on a city. That framing, while tidy, misses the damage done under calm management. People pressed into debt, honest businesses pushed aside in favor of connected vendors, union elections tilted by fear, public trust eroded by payoffs, contractors forced to pick partners they didn't want, and workers taught that favors decide their shift more than merit does. He excelled at keeping that harm out of the headlines. History should not mistake that quiet for kindness. In tracing his final months, it helps to remember how small things become catalysts. A slight in a meeting, a denied request for an extra slice of a root, a complaint about an old rule that blocks a new profit, none of these looks grand. In rooms where men measure status by who sits where and who speaks last, those moments mattered. Caponegro did not go from loyal earner to rebel overnight. He collected disappointments like stones in a pocket until he convinced himself the stones were a key. The irony is that Angelo, who had survived by reading people closely and easing their pride, did not see how heavy that pocket had become. Or if he did, he trusted habit too much. His entire career had taught him that time and manners fix almost everything. This time they didn't. When the city buried him, dignitaries stayed away, and neighbors filled the space. Some brought stories about small kindnesses, a favor with a bill, a quiet donation for a team's uniforms, a word with a landlord who needed a nudge. Those stories were true, just not the whole truth. Men who had spent years moving cash from barrooms to captains kept their heads down and waited to see whether they would be asked to move the same cash for a new boss. At police headquarters, maps went up, lines drawn between faces, arrows showing who might turn on whom. In New York, the council that sets the rules made clear that unsanctioned killings would be punished. In North Jersey and South Philly, men who had once felt invincible learned how quick that invincibility disappears when you misjudge your permission. From a distance now, his story to this point looks almost circular. He had entered the life as a listener with a gift for reducing sparks. He rose because he could turn heat into quiet and quiet into income. He held power by convincing men that staying home at night was better than standing in court the next morning. He lost power because other men stopped believing that patience would feed them. The end, when it came, was exactly what he had spent 2 decades preventing. A headline, a crowd, a block, turned into a set piece for the Runzer. Nightly news. The story does not end there, of course. After him, the chair changed hands, then changed hands again under the blast that took his successor. The men he had kept at the edge moved to the center. The city learned the cost of losing a leader who, for all his harms, hated spectacle. Federal cases that had lurked in background for years took shape and began to march through courtrooms. Atlantic City, which he had hoped to guide from the side, became a stage for disputes that couldn't be settled in kitchens. The Philadelphia organization, once disciplined by a soft voice and a firm code, entered years of volatility. Morning light washed the South Philadelphia block where he used to pause and smooth the front of his coat. Neighbors still set out milk crates to claim parking spots, still greeted delivery drivers, still swept the same short slabs of sidewalk. Yet the rhythm was off. The stoop where he liked to stand felt like a stage left after a curtain drop. People talked low. They said his quiet had kept the city from boiling. They said the peace had rested on one man's rules and an understanding that money would move and tempers would not. In rooms where he had spent years lowering voices, the voices rose again. The answer from higher up arrived fast. The National Council that arbitrated disputes did not like surprises, and what had happened in Philadelphia was the biggest surprise of all. A leader removed without sanction. Antonio Caponegro, the hard-edged North Jersey earner who had grown impatient and gathered allies, vanished from his usual circuit. Word came from New York that he and his close associate Alfred Salerno had been found dead, a punishment that needed no speeches. It wasn't about sympathy for the man Caponegro had moved against. It was about order. If every grievance turned into an unsanctioned strike, the whole system fell apart. The message was clear. The council alone decided when a chair changed hands. In Philadelphia, the choice to steady things fell to a veteran who had long stood near Angelo's desk. Philip Testa, quiet in his own way and fierce about keeping neighborhoods from spiraling, took the lead. He did not promise revolutions. He promised a return to the way that had worked. Keep gambling steady, keep loans under watch, keep union ties useful but controlled, keep Atlantic City's new economy at arm's length and out of the headlines. He filled chairs around him with men he believed could keep tempers cool. He visited the same kitchens where Angelo used to hear arguments and settle them with almost no one raising a voice. For a short run, the old routine held. Those months shimmer now because of what followed. The fault lines that had cracked beneath the surface during the last year of Angelo's life hadn't healed. They just got quiet while people measured their next move. Some captains still felt they had been kept from the best of the shore money. Others still chafed at rules that blocked narcotics revenues that had made fortunes elsewhere. A few had taken exile under Angelo as a personal slight and had no intention of living that way any longer. One of those was Nicodemo Scarfo, a man Angelo had pushed out of the city years earlier to keep the core calm. Scarfo stayed in Atlantic City through lean years and watched neon return with a glare that said it belonged to him. In the spring of 1981, the city woke to another shock. A device exploded at Philip Testa's home, ending his short tenure. No one publicly took credit. The aftermath pointed inward, not outward, and the lesson for anyone from the old guard was brutal. The soft approach that had kept streets ordinary under Angelo had been replaced by something meaner. The new rules weren't written on paper. They were announced by events. Men who had once spent nights in back rooms hashing out compromises now braced for sudden blasts. The city felt it. So did investigators. They knew that when the top no longer enforced restraint, a long, hard storm usually followed. Within months, that storm had a name. Scarfo emerged as the man at the center, and his methods could not have been more different from Angelo's. He wanted tribute from anyone running almost anything, and he favored displays that proved a point. He spoke in terms of taxes on businesses that had always paid once and now had to pay again. He demanded visibility. The Philadelphia organization, once proud of its low-profile way of making money, grew loud. Disputes that Angelo would have cooled over soup broke into open fights. Marriages between crews dissolved into grudges. The local press, starved for drama during the years of quiet, suddenly had more headlines than it could fit. Law enforcement moved with the new rhythm. The modern racketeering law gave prosecutors tools Angelo had managed to avoid before because he left so little on tape and paper. Now, taped conversations about street taxes, loans, and threats turned into multi-count cases against entire crews. Agents paired wiretaps with surveillance and tax audits. The neat map Angelo had drawn years earlier captains over small teams, each with defined lanes, helped investigators lay out charts for juries. The same structure that had made his rule efficient now made his successors legible in court. Against that backdrop, people remembered Angelo in two ways. Some, especially in blocks where his presence meant fewer public incidents, remembered stability. They talked about dropping a few dollars on the numbers and seeing the same man pick up the slips every day for years without drama. They mentioned jukeboxes, cigarette machines, and small card games tucked into private rooms where no one carried on loudly. They recalled a leader who found a way to avoid turf wars. Others remembered the cost under the calm. Little businesses forced into vending contracts they didn't want. Restaurant owners nudged into hiring workers from a preferred list. High-interest loans that trapped people. Inspectors and public employees pressured to look away or to look too closely, depending on who asked. Both pictures were true. Angelo's brand of control worked because it obscured the harm under polite routine. It is worth pausing to count, as investigators did, the activities tied to his tenure. Gambling in many forms, sports books run by phone and in person, neighborhood lotteries known as numbers, basement card games that stayed small by design, high-interest lending to people who fell behind or who chased betting streaks. Extortion disguised as insurance for bars and clubs, meaning money paid to avoid trouble. Vending routes that delivered coin machines to diners and lounges and returned a slice to the route holder. Influence over unions that touched docks, warehouses, construction sites, and hospitality jobs. Influence that steered contracts, job calls, and vendor lists. Later, as Atlantic City reopened for business, footholds in supply chains that fed hotels and casinos linens, food, waste, machine maintenance, transportation, and loading dock security. Add to that quiet pressure on public officials who signed permits or inspected sites. None of this needs romantic words. It was a system that overcharged the city twice, once through illicit tribute, and again through the distortions that follow when fear and favor replace competition. He managed all that without long stretches in prison. Why? Distance and discipline. He didn't keep ledger books. He didn't discuss specifics on open lines. He preferred to talk in kitchens he trusted, or while standing by a window with a radio loud enough to blur any device an agent might hide. He accepted contempt citations when he refused grand jury questions and paid fines as the price of staying quiet. He cultivated an image the public found dull, a neighbor with tidy habits, a soft-spoken man who liked coffee, who remembered names and small kindnesses. Reporters looking for dramatic quotes got none. Jurors who expected a showman got a soft voice and long pauses. That combination kept him on his stoop, while others in his world spent years in cells. Behind the presentation stood a disciplined inner circle. For a long stretch, his counselor was Joseph Rugnetta, a veteran who shared his taste for calm. Rugnetta died in 1977. In the gap that followed, Angelo elevated Caponegro. That choice, likely made because of Caponegro's numbers and seniority, sowed trouble, because the new counselor believed speed and force should replace patience. The friendship with Carlo Gambino in New York had been a cushion. The shift after Gambino's death removed that cushion. Angelo kept the same table but now sat at it without the old chairs around him. Those changing seats, more than any other factor, explain why the last years grew tense. He was the same man he had always been. The room around him wasn't. As for narcotics, his stated policy stayed consistent, not in his house. Agents and later memoirs debate how absolute that rule was. Some accounts say certain streams operated far from South Philadelphia, so long as they did not splash nearby and so long as tribute moved. Others insist he held the line and punished any hint of it. Even the appearance of exceptions bred resentment. Men who played by the rules and watched others collect in secret felt burned. That feeling fed the narrative that he had grown out of step. It also shaped how history remembers him. To some, a man who protected neighborhoods from a trade that tears them apart. To others, a realist whose public line hid private allowances. With records sealed by silence and key players gone, the full truth sits somewhere in the fog between. Union influence under him deserves a closer look, not to admire it but to understand its reach. A dockworkers' union determined who loaded and unloaded ships and trucks, a decision that affected which companies could deliver on time. A construction local controlled, who stood on scaffolds, and who waited at the dimming out hall, a call that could delay or greenlight a project worth millions. A bartender's or hotel employee's local set the tone in bars, restaurants, and hotel floors. In each space, having a friend in the right chair meant fewer delays, fewer surprise inspections, fewer picket lines. Angelo's circle placed people who could make those calls or influence them. In exchange, contractors and owners paid consulting or labor peace fees or agreed to steer supply contracts to companies connected to his world. These arrangements didn't just skim money, they bent markets, forcing honest competitors to either play along or be priced out. The harm rippled outward to workers who never knew why their hours shifted. His method of keeping disputes in-house kept dramatic incidents off the front page. A bookmaker who tried to skate without paying tribute didn't get a scene in the street. He got steady visits, reminders, and pressure applied in ways that didn't draw a crowd. A captain who let his crew grow reckless didn't get publicly shamed. He got a partner and a warning, and if the numbers didn't improve, he got replaced without fanfare. The effect, even now, is easy to misread. Calm on the surface doesn't mean gentle underneath. It means control. That was the essence of his rule. It's also why his death felt, to many who ran legal businesses in the region, like the removal of a predictable cost. The unpredictable costs that followed under successors made law enforcement's job both easier because the noise created evidence, and harder because the violence scared off witnesses. He left behind a family that had lived inside two worlds without crossing the lines he marked between them. At home, he was a husband and father, an older relative who appeared at baptisms, weddings, and Sunday meals. He liked routine. He parked in the same places and ate at the same tables. He read the paper, talked about weather and sports, and listened to neighborhood gossip as if it were the news that mattered most. He carried himself the same way in those spaces and in back rooms where men talked about routes and union votes. The difference was that the second set of rooms carried a shadow cost to the city he said he loved. He wouldn't have called it that. He would have called it business. As investigators wrote summaries after his death, they sketched his career in clean lines. A boy from Villalba who learned the city young. A listener who rose under early bosses. A patient climber who secured his chair in 1959 after visiting New York and asking for an orderly transition. A leader who chose earnings that drew less heat. A man who used union ties to push contracts and job calls. A boss who discouraged narcotics and kept flashy earners at the edge. A survivor who avoided long prison time by speaking in generalities and trusting distance. A neighbor who waved on his stoop and got called gentle for his tone. A figure whose restraint papered over the harm that routine extortion produces. The list reads like a ledger, because that's how he treated his days. In time, the same patience that had served him so well went from asset to liability in the eyes of hungry men. The boardwalk glittered again. The chance to plug into huge revenue streams thrilled people who had waited years. Angelo looked at the glitter and saw regulatory boards, background checks, subpoenas, and cameras. He picked the edges and placed quiet people there. Others looked at the same lights and saw opportunity too big to share slowly. That difference of vision, one eye on risk, one eye on reward, created the friction that cracked his rule. If there is a single lesson to take from the switch that came after him, it is that tone matters in any organization built on fear and money. Under him, fear was a quiet pressure always present, rarely shouted. Under Scarfo, fear arrived loud. Under him, money flowed like a steady river. Under Scarfo, money came fast and dangerous, and it dried up under the glare of raids and trials. Under him, men went home at night. Under Scarfo, more of them did not. The city, which had grown used to a certain dullness around its underworld, learned what noise sounds like. Years later, when reporters and historians tried to rank figures by power or impact, Angelo's name often rose because he had kept the city relatively calm and relatively prosperous for his circle for a long time. The better measure is damage avoided and damage done. He avoided the spectacular harms that follow public wars. He did harm by embedding a private tax on commerce and by normalizing arrangements that taught a generation that the only way to move forward was to know someone who knew someone. That second harm is quiet and lasting. It lingers in institutions and in the habits of people who work around them. He is often compared to leaders in New York, with whom he shared a taste for order. Carlo Gambino above all. The comparison holds in style. Both preferred balance to fireworks. Both kept their names off paper. Both focused on steady revenue streams. The key difference lies in the size of their stages. Gambino operated in a city where the money and the heat were both greater. Angelo worked in a smaller arena and used that scale to his advantage. He could know the faces that mattered and their sons and brothers. He could keep a map in his head and alter it in a morning. That closeness produced loyalty and resented closeness at the same time. When you bring his life back into focus after the storms that followed, you see a man who built a wide, illegal enterprise by refusing to act like a movie character. He didn't pound tables. He didn't dress like a peacock. He didn't embrace the swagger that draws crowds. He kept rules, and he made sure the people under him understood that stepping outside them drew consequences. The fact that he ended the way he did tells you not that the rules failed, but that other men stopped believing in them. That turn is the axis on which the Philadelphia story spins. By the time new trials filled the dockets and new headlines shouted about bombings and street taxes, his name had already passed from fact to story. People used it to argue that restraint is the mark of wisdom, or to argue that restraint is a mask worn by people who don't want you to look too hard. The truth sits in the middle. He was a careful man who ran harmful schemes with discipline. He liked his city and burdened it at the same time. He kept violence low because low was profitable, not because low is noble. He was, in short, what he had always been, a realist about human nature and a believer in routine. Years after the quiet man on the South Philadelphia stoop was gone, the picture of how he worked came into sharper focus. Investigators pulled old files, matched them with newer interviews, and realized how much of his reign depended on a certain rhythm: steady earnings, no public scenes, rules that kept hot tempers at a low simmer. People who had dealt with him up close said the same thing in different words. He preferred deals to drama, expected tribute on time, and shut down anything that might pull cameras to a block. What looked like calm from a distance was, up close, an intricate schedule of collections, meetings, nudges, and reminders. To understand what he did, you follow the money. The backbone of his world was gambling sports bets taken by phone or in back rooms, neighborhood numbers built on 3-digit hits, card games that stayed just small enough to avoid weekly raids. Bookmakers kept ledgers, runners picked up slips, and collectors made sure the house always got its cut. People like to say these were victimless habits. The record shows something else. Debts built quickly, pressure followed, and the fear of losing a corner, a route, or a job call kept people paying. The money moved upward on a fixed calendar, sometimes in envelopes, sometimes in receipts coded to look like ordinary business, always with a chain of custody that kept him far from the initial count. Alongside gambling came high-interest loans. The word everyone used was Shylock. Rates were steep. Payments were enforced. A bar owner behind on his shipments might take a quick infusion with the hope of catching up by the next holiday. A bettor who thought he saw a trend might borrow to chase it and find himself deeper after a weekend. The collectors in his circle were told to be firm and to stay off the evening news. That last part mattered more than anything. If a problem required pressure, the pressure had to be applied in ways that did not produce flashing lights or questioning neighbors. It was harm by routine, and the routine was deliberate. He wrapped those rackets in a net of legitimate businesses that looked ordinary enough from the sidewalk. Coin-operated routes, jukeboxes, cigarette machines, pinball, and later video games were placed in bars, diners, and clubs across the city and the counties over the bridges. The machine put money in the till. The location owner took a share. The route company took its larger share. If a bar owner wanted a different vendor, someone from the route company explained why the current relationship worked best. In many cases, the route company was legal on paper and connected in practice. That connection kept competitors away and guaranteed steady quarters into the same hands for years. Union influence tied his world together. A dock local controlled who touched cargo. A building trades local decided who got called to a site. A bartenders or hotel workers local set the tone inside restaurants and hotels. If a contractor wanted no delays, he needed to know that the wrong kind of noise wouldn't appear on a Monday morning. If a hotel wanted its rooms staffed on a weekend, it needed a smooth line from the hall to the front desk. Those who lived inside the system knew which labor consultant to call. That consultant often traced back to his circle. The payments for such calm wore different labels: consulting fees, introductions, donations, but they worked the same way. Money in exchange for predictable days. When Atlantic City legalized casino gambling, his method didn't change. Only the stage got bigger. He focused on the edges. Hotels needed mountains of linens washed on schedule. Restaurants needed food delivered without hiccups. Loading docks needed order. Old jukebox and vending routes now competed with slot machine service contracts and fulfillment work. He placed reliable men one layer removed from the casino floor, in companies that passed background checks and answered questions politely. The risk of scandal sat lower there, and the money, modest when measured against table revenues, came cleanly enough to survive regulation. The approach angered some in his own camp, who craved a bigger bite. He kept telling them the same thing. Edges are safer than centers. He dealt in another currency too. Access, permits, inspections, deliveries, shutoffs, temporary variances, small decisions made daily by public offices could tilt a business toward growth or ruin. People inside city or county desks heard from old friends. Those friends asked for nothing dramatic, just a little help, a little patience, a little speed. If the favor moved, a thank you found its way back through a chain of hands. Nothing so large that it shouted. Nothing so small that it didn't count. This is how he shaped the environment around him without changing the skyline. The result was a quiet tax on time and opportunity, paid by anyone who wanted peace. He also clung to a rule that defined his image. No drug dealing in his house. He said it in kitchens and hallways, and it reached down the chain as a command. Accounts differ on how airtight the rule was. Some men say he allowed activity far from South Philadelphia, so long as it stayed invisible locally and tribute arrived. Others insist he reacted with anger to any hint of it. Either way, the stated policy gave him a moral pose in a world with little room for such poses. It kept public outrage down and, he believed, kept federal heat manageable. It also bred bitterness among earners who watched faster money swell elsewhere. He stayed in motion through constant attention from investigators. His name appeared in files kept by city police, state commissions, federal agencies, and congressional committees. He sat for subpoenas, invoked his rights, and took contempt citations when pressed. He was photographed leaving restaurants and funerals. He was surveilled in cars and on sidewalks. Agents bugged rooms where he might talk and got more chatter about weather and family than business. He took care to avoid saying anything a tape could carry into a courtroom with sharp edges. He kept business talk so general that it meant one thing to the person across the table and nothing to anyone without context. This was discipline, not luck. A few episodes became touchstones for how he moved. In the late 1950s, when an acting leader considered removing him, an older hand in the room warned him, and he went north to ask for a clean ruling from the National Council. He got it, came home, and put the city back on a tidy schedule. In the mid-1960s, when televised hearings turned mob bosses into ready-made characters, he refused to play a part. He offered no lines and no show. In the 1970s, As Atlantic City inched toward legalized gambling, he prepared his people to apply the same old habits to a new world. Keep the edges tidy, keep faces unobtrusive, keep paperwork clean. Each time, he chose patience over spectacle. The legal paper trail attached to his name never matched the scale of his influence, which said as much about his methods as it did about the limits of the law at the time. He collected contempt fines. He was named in investigative reports about illegal gambling and union corruption. Associates, bookmakers, collectors, union officers were charged and convicted in state and federal courts, but long sentences for him personally did not arrive. He had built a buffer of distance and habit. He didn't sign contracts. He did not keep books in his house. He used intermediaries, who used their own intermediaries. When agents finally met someone ready to talk, that person often knew the layer below him and guessed at the layer above. That fog kept him free. When he was gone, the fog thinned because the replacement regime made noise. Under Nicodemo Scarfo, public extortion schemes brought microphones, cooperating witnesses, and indictments that finally knitted together pieces prosecutors had chased for years. The very term used in courtrooms Bruno Scarfo family tied his quiet years to the loud ones that followed, and trials in the 1980s and early 1990s laid out for juries how the old revenue streams worked and where they led. Even then, most of what jurors heard about his era came as context, not as counts against him. His legacy was a network described in charts, the soft voice behind it recalled by agents who had chased a shadow. People sometimes ask whether he was better for the city than those who came after him. That question misses the point. His model reduced public explosions because explosions ruin business. It did not reduce harm. It normalized payoffs. It turned job calls into favors. It made bar owners accept vendors they didn't want. It habituated contractors to costs that had nothing to do with materials or labor. It taught people that the fastest way through a problem was to find a friend who knew someone near the levers. That habit can outlast any one man. It quietly pushes out those who don't have the right introductions. He was good at making that feel like weather always there, rarely discussed. He also built something else that was less visible but just as real. A code of conduct inside his circle that, while often broken, held long enough to define a generation. Don't involve families in disputes. Don't bring trouble home. Don't fight over television channels when the game is the electricity bill. Solve small problems before they turn into badges and flashbulbs. Go home at night. Those lines were not written down, but people repeated them because they worked, and because they made men who committed crimes believe they were upholding some rough standard. When men stopped believing in that standard, the structure he'd enforced with patience collapsed quickly. Details from his final months have been told many times. The new money in Atlantic City, the resentment from North Jersey, the change in New York after a friend's death, the misreading of permission by a lieutenant who wanted the chair, the sudden end on a row house block. The part that matters for the full picture is what those details reveal about his career. He didn't rely on charisma, he relied on design. He organized people, territory, and time. He picked revenue streams that wore the same clothes as everyday life. He kept violence away from storefronts and stoops, because stoops and storefronts were his camouflage. He accepted that he would always be under surveillance, and built a life that made surveillance feel like listening to static. He also lived as a neighbor. That doesn't cancel anything, and it doesn't excuse anything. It helps explain why his myth stuck. He waved from his steps. He remembered the names of kids who walked past his house. He appeared at fundraisers and funerals with envelopes and a handshake. He presented as a man who understood the rules of the block and honored them in small ways. Many older residents still tell stories about those courtesies with warmth. They place those memories next to darker memories of pressure to install a certain machine, to hire a certain crew, to pay a little extra to avoid a late inspection, and decide which to emphasize. Memory is a choice. He benefited from that. He was not the first to build such a system in Philadelphia, and he wouldn't be the last to try. What set him apart was how long he kept it running without jolts. From 1959 to 1980, the city saw fewer high-profile clashes in his world than in the eras before and after. That line on the graph matters. So does the footnote that explains it. Fewer clashes didn't mean fewer injuries to civic life. It meant the injuries were better hidden. Some pieces of the story remain disputed even now. How tight was his ban on narcotics? How much did he know about certain deals in distant towns? How many allowances did he make for earner A that earner B didn't get? Which early arrests shaped his caution? The people who could answer those questions in full are gone, and the paper record, by design, is thin. What survives are snapshots. A man framed in a doorway, a car idling at a curb, a kitchen table with coffee rings, and hardly any words that anyone could quote later. From those frames you build an honest summary of his conduct: illegal gambling, extortion under soft names, high-interest lending with quiet enforcement, influence over unions and public decisions, fronts in vending and distribution, attempts to shape Atlantic City commerce from one step away, alliances with larger organizations across the river, and a studied refusal to appear at the center of anything that might send him away for years. The angle that best explains him is work, not theater. He saw his days as tasks to be completed, obstacles to be smoothed, distractions to be ignored. He wore the same kinds of suits. He ate the same meals. He kept close counsel. He didn't turn every gathering into a scene, didn't insist on special treatment in public, didn't ride in a caravan. He gave the impression that nothing in his schedule could be urgent, because urgency shows. That patience gave him time to build and space to think 2 problems ahead. It did not save him when the people around him decided that patience stood between them and the future they wanted. In the end, the list of things he did is straightforward. He rose through a Sicilian-rooted organization in Philadelphia. He gained the top post with support from men in New York who valued order. He ran gambling books and numbers through captains who controlled neighborhoods, and he took tribute from those who ran them. He oversaw high-interest lending and ensured collections stayed quiet. He protected and profited from coin machine routes and other vending placements. He exerted influence over labor in docks, trucking, construction, hospitality, and service sectors to steer contracts, job calls, and vendor lists. He paid off or pressured public employees to speed or slow approvals. He set a policy against narcotics in his territory and enforced it as a line of public posture and, at times, as practical rule. He built edges around the new casino economy to extract steady revenue while avoiding direct control of casino floors. He maintained alliances with New York leaders to keep peace at borders and balance in disputes. He avoided long prison terms by refusing to testify, by speaking carefully, and by keeping distance from day-to-day acts. He died in 1980, after internal rivals decided his caution blocked their ambitions. That's the ledger. Without flourish. People who talk about him now do so because his way of running things is a study in how harm can be orderly. He made a city feel uneventful while reshaping who got what, when, and how. He operated by removing friction where it served him and adding it where it didn't. He taught men under him to live by a code that fit in a suit pocket. He convinced a neighborhood that stability had a single face. He left behind a contest over what that stability meant. The answer depends on where you stood when his car rolled past. The years after his death taught Philadelphia what his restraint had really done. People had called his rule quiet because the city went to sleep most nights, without sirens tied to his world. When that quiet lifted, the sudden volume made the earlier hum feel like a design, not an accident. Prosecutors, agents, and journalists dug into old cases and built new ones with tools that didn't exist when he first took the chair. The map he had kept in his head crews, corners, captains, union links, vendors was redrawn on oversized boards for juries. The same routes that had collected small bills under low light were now arrows on display. You could watch the process start with paper. Investigations that once landed as thin files now arrived as binders. Subpoenas went not just to bookmakers and route men, but to banks, accountants, city offices, and union halls. Instead of asking a single gambler where he placed a bet, agents asked how the ledger was kept, who picked up slips, how the money moved, and which bar had a machine in the back by the restroom. A city that had lived alongside these habits for decades got a look at how routine can be used as a shield. The picture traced back through his methods, even when the names on the indictments belonged to the men who followed him. In court, the phrase, Bruno Scarfo family, appeared often. Prosecutors used it to link 2 eras, the calm surface of the old regime and the storm that followed under his successor. Witnesses described Thursday lunches, kitchen meetings, and rules about who could bring problems to which captain. They explained how a numbers runner knew which row houses to visit and what to say when a new homeowner asked questions. They talked about how jukebox and cigarette routes stayed fixed for years, and how the man at the top expected a share without ever appearing at account. These weren't new facts to investigators, but this time they were delivered in a single narrative that a jury could follow from front door to back room. Appeals courts wrote opinions that would be studied in law schools, and Philadelphia's story sat inside some of them. Judges explained what an enterprise looks like when it isn't a company with a logo, but a network bound by rules, loyalty, and profit. They described how illegal gambling, extortion, and loan collections, when tied together through a continuing structure, could be charged under a single statute. The names were those of men active after him, but the structure mirrored what he had refined: neighborhood crews, tribute flowing upward, a shared code, and a habit of resolving disputes off the street. Atlantic City, the place he had approached like a machine to be fed at the edges, proved a rougher field for those who came after. The casinos drew crowds and money, but also deep oversight. New Jersey's regulators built thick files, asked blunt questions, and pulled licenses when answers came up short. That environment fit his old instincts: stay a layer away, keep faces clean, do nothing that required a public defense. His successors chose force instead of patience, and contractors learned to expect calls that sounded less like a request and more like a demand. Those calls produced tapes and testimony. What he had tried to make look like a normal supply chain turned into a line of evidence. A neighbor might ask why his name kept returning in courtrooms years after he was gone. The answer is that he built a model with such reach that it took a generation to untangle. Consider how many institutions his circle touched: bars and diners where machines lived, small clubs where card games stayed on side tables, union halls where job calls were decided, city offices where permits were stamped, docks and warehouses where deliveries were timed, vendors who stocked hotels. Each touch point seemed small on its own. Together they formed a web that could be mapped, measured, and eventually charged. The people who took over that web were louder. The web, though, had his shape. Inside the neighborhoods, the memory of his manners outlived the memory of his methods. Older residents spoke about his wave from the stoop, as if that wave had kept streets safe. They recalled the way he showed up at funerals with a quiet word for a widow. They told stories about an envelope for a youth team or a hospital bill. These things happened. So did the rest. Pressure to place a certain machine, to hire a certain crew, to pay an extra fee, to avoid a delay that wasn't supposed to happen anyway. Under him, both realities lived side by side. In the bright glare that followed, only the gentler stories felt comfortable to tell out loud. His refusal to let narcotics take root in his lanes became part of his legend. Some said he kept the worst of that trade out of South Philadelphia by telling his men to look elsewhere, or not at all. Others, especially those who felt cheated by what they saw as quiet exceptions, argued that the rule only held for those without connections. Whatever the truth, the policy shaped his public image during hearings and press coverage. When agents compared him to louder bosses elsewhere, they framed him as someone who kept his city from the crashes that followed open drug wars. That framing helped him in life. In death, it softened the discussion around him. It did not erase the harm his other rackets caused. The union pieces deserve another look because they explain how his influence lasted into new eras. A labor local can be a gatekeeper without breaking a law. It can send a particular crew to a site. It can set an order for deliveries. It can call a brief walkout to settle a grievance. When the person in a key chair takes suggestions from someone outside the union office, power shifts. The result is not only money diverted from honest transactions, it is a habit taught to everyone waiting for a job call. Outcomes depend on relationships. Under him, those relationships were built slowly and maintained carefully, like a garden that needed constant tending. Under those who followed, the garden was trampled. The difference changed how easy it was for law enforcement to show a jury that a quiet suggestion was a veiled demand. Reporters who had grown used to his silence finally found sources willing to talk in the 1980s. Some were former associates who faced charges and traded information for leniency. Others were rival figures who enjoyed painting him as overly cautious or hypocritical. A few were public employees who had retired and felt freer to describe the favors they were asked to grant. Their testimonies rarely produced a single dramatic revelation. Instead, They confirmed the pattern. He made money by normalizing small irregularities across hundreds of days and dozens of places. A delivery arrives early. An inspection happens late. A machine finds a corner. A club adds one extra table behind a curtain. None of these looks like a headline. Together, they form the background of a city bent in quiet ways. There were also reminders of how completely he had separated his home from his work. Family members, who had lived with the man who drank coffee on the porch and took an interest in school and church, were not fixtures in the criminal cases that followed. He had drawn a line and held it. That choice was practical public family drama. Attracts attention, and cultural. He believed family should not bear the weight of what he chose to do. People who grew up near him remember that line as a kind of old world code. It was also good business. The fewer connections between domestic life and the enterprise, the harder it is for investigators to pull one thread and unravel the whole sweater. It is tempting to say he ran a city the way a careful manager runs a company. The difference is that a company operates under rules that protect open competition and public oversight, while his system operated by bending those rules out of view. He did not add value to the services he touched. He extracted value. He did not create opportunity. He redirected it. He did not keep streets calm because he valued peace as a public good. He did it because calm corridors are reliable corridors for cash. Keeping those distinctions clear matters when people talk about him as a good boss. Good for whom is the real question. His alliances across the river mattered less for their glamour than for their function. He paid respect to older, larger organizations in New York because those organizations could make his life difficult or smooth it out. Under Carlo Gambino, the understanding was simple. Maintain order, share enough, and stay out of public brawls. When leadership changed in New York, the language of those understandings changed with it. That shift, more than his own behavior, altered the balance that had protected his chair for years. Without the personal cushion of a like-minded ally, his choices faced more second-guessing, more pressure, and eventually open revolt. One detail from the end continues to draw interest, because it shows how close some people were to him. The man behind the wheel the night he died, John Stanfa, had been a steady presence for years. A driver who saw the city through his windshield while his boss kept a mental schedule in the passenger seat. After the killing, Stanfa refused to cooperate with investigators. He faced charges for his refusal and served time. Years later, he would step forward as a leader himself, proof that proximity during the quiet years could turn into authority during the loud ones. His trajectory says as much about the power of proximity under Angelo as it does about the way reputations are made in their world. As for Atlantic City's promise, it soured faster than boosters predicted. The oversight that Angelo had taken seriously turned out to be the barrier that his successors tried to shove aside. Gaming regulators asked hard questions about ownership, suppliers, and contracts. Casinos, under pressure to keep their licenses clean, cut ties whenever a hint of trouble appeared. The result was a string of public fights that produced exactly the headlines Angelo had worked for decades to avoid. Contracts were canceled, unions faced scrutiny, and vendors scrambled. The notion of extracting quiet value from the edges gave way to a scramble with subpoenas in the air. It was the wrong environment for his model, and a worse one for anyone who thought noise could substitute for design. Even as the city adjusted to a different kind of boss, Angelo's name stayed useful. People invoked him when they wanted to argue for patience, to warn about inviting too much attention, to remind a room that rapid moves rarely end well. They also used his name to justify resisting change. That's not how he did it, someone might say when asked to share more from a growing root, or to allow a new scheme in from the cold. In that sense, his memory was a tool. Men who had benefited from his caution pointed to it as a rule. Men who felt stifled by it used the same memory as a target to knock down. His ghost sat in many rooms without saying a word. Law enforcement, for its part, learned from him as well. The years they spent following his empty conversations taught them to seek evidence not in the obvious places but in the margins. Utility records, notepads in a diner, spare keys to back rooms, rental ledgers for machines moved between bars. They organized task forces that blended different skills: financial analysis, surveillance, labor law, tax expertise, because his network had lived at the intersection of those lines. When they turned those methods on the men who came after him, They found more to work with because the volume had been turned up. Still, the architecture they described belonged to him. If you step back and look at the arc from a boy off a boat to a man whose name named a family for decades, you see a set of skills that explain both his longevity and his end. He understood people. He understood how money behaves in a city. He understood that a habit, once made normal, is the strongest kind of control. He also understood risk, but he underestimated the hunger of men who had been taught to wait and then decided they were done waiting. That miscalculation cost him everything. It also became a cautionary story told to young faces at tables he used to sit at. Don't confuse a calm voice with safety, and don't mistake a long line of good days for a guarantee about tomorrow. In the legacy he left, two truths sit together. He kept a kind of order that spared Philadelphia the spectacle that scarred other places. He did it by running rackets that drained the city quietly every day. The first truth makes him easy to remember kindly on a block where people value manners and routine. The second truth is the one courts finally put into words years after he was gone. Together they form the full picture of his life's work. The 1990s arrived, with the city still measuring itself against a memory. Older men in coffee shops talked about rules that used to keep tempers down. Younger faces, raised on louder headlines and bigger promises, wanted momentum. Between them sat a name that wouldn't leave the room. People said his calm had been a choice, not a mood, a way of keeping money moving without turning neighborhoods into stages. That idea, and the habits built under it, shaped what came next even after others took the chair. By the end of the Scarfo era, federal cases had rolled up much of the loudest wing. Trials tied together street taxes, threats, gambling, and union rackets that had pushed into public view. Scarfo went away for a long time. His underboss, Philip Leonetti, cooperated and filled in gaps for agents who had tracked the organization for years. What remained in Philadelphia was a vacuum and a question. Who could restore a steady beat after a decade of noise? The answer, for a while, was a familiar driver. John Stanfa had been a quiet presence in Angelo's last years, often behind the wheel, always near, but never flashy. When the 1990s began, with New York's council still a force even after its own leaders faced historic trials, Stanfa was blessed as a stabilizing choice. The logic was simple. He came from the old school, had kept his mouth shut when it counted, and carried no appetite for theatrics. He aimed to bring back a version of the Bruno map. Crews with clear lanes, tribute on schedule, conflicts settled in rooms rather than in the street. He tried to rebuild on those lines. Sports books reopened, numbers slips moved, and vending routes, which had survived the chaos by force of habit, kept rattling quarters into boxes. Collections resumed under the same rule Angelo had favored. Firm and quiet. On the shore, with casinos now part of daily talk, Stanfa reinforced the idea that the family should live in the supply chains, not the showrooms, laundry, food deliveries, machine service, loading docks, union calm. The plan was not new. It was a return to a routine that had once kept the peace. But time had moved. Some younger figures who had come up under Scarfo saw the throne differently. They wanted visibility and a bigger slice. Joey Merlino emerged at the center of that energy. He was young, quick with a smile, and unafraid of cameras. Around him gathered a group friends since adolescence, and now ambitious organizers, who believed the city had turned the page. They labeled themselves a modern crew in a modern world, and they treated the old guard as an obstacle. Their confidence grew when an older inmate, Ralph Natali, came home in the mid-1990s with stories of past connections and the posture of a man who had once stood close to power. He lent them a touch of legitimacy, and they gave him the energy and reach he no longer had. The rivalry with Stanfa didn't stay rhetorical. By 1992, the tension surfaced beyond whispers. Meetings ended with narrow eyes. People switched tables in restaurants. Men known to be close to one side crossed streets earlier than usual, if someone from the other side turned the corner. The old rule, keep disputes off the sidewalk, began to fail. The city felt the change before it could name it. The pace of cars on certain blocks altered at dusk. Doors that had stayed open for years shut earlier than usual. Nights grew watchful. The moment Philadelphia still talks about came in 1993 on a stretch of highway. A moving car pulled alongside Stanfa's and shots tore the morning apart. The old driver, who had tried to steer the city back to a muted rhythm, survived, though a family member riding with him was wounded. It was the kind of public scene Angelo had spent 2 decades preventing. The kind of incident that draws both sirens and cameras. After that day, the war had a schedule. Counters, feints, and open warnings that spread fear through blocks that had always prided themselves on routine. Another name that set the tone for that summer was Michael Ciancaglini, a young figure close to Merlino. He was killed that year. Other attempts landed or missed in quick succession. Without going into grim detail, the pattern was clear. Ambushes on busy streets, startled diners, neighbors who hit the floor before they even knew why. The difference between then and the old Bruno days was not just the number of incidents, it was the setting. What had once been kept to back rooms spilled into places that had always felt safe. That was the line older residents could not forgive. Law enforcement, which had spent years building RICO cases out of calm days and subtle pressure, suddenly had something else. Chaos that made witnesses less tolerant of silence. An insider named John Veazey, initially part of the Stanfa side, switched and spoke. Surveillance caught hurried chatter. Financial records, once hard to tie together, now made sense when compared with recorded conversations. Prosecutors pushed forward, and in the mid-1990s, Stanfa and his associates faced a racketeering case that pulled in murders, extortion, gambling, and union reach. He was convicted and sent away for life. A man who had learned to keep to the background in Angelo's shadow carried that background with him into a cell. The young faction took the win as an opening. With Natali playing an elder's role boss in name, public presence kept low, and Merlino acting as the face on the street, the organization tried to unify under a new style. It did not match the old codes. The public saw a leader at sports games, at restaurants, in photos. Houses in South Philadelphia, once known for modest facades, now played host to well-lit gatherings. A tone that Angelo would have flagged as dangerous became the brand. Some in the neighborhood enjoyed the spectacle. Others worried because they had seen what attention brings. More surveillance, more informants, more cases. The legal storm arrived again by the end of the decade. Natal, who had walked out of prison into a title and a partnership, was arrested in 1998 on drug charges. Facing a long sentence, he chose a path Angelo had always managed to keep off his ledger. He cooperated. In 1999, he became the first sitting boss in the American underworld to turn state's evidence. He described internal maps, explained the split with Stanfa, and narrated the 1990s war for juries that needed a guide through a messy period. It was a stunning moment for a culture that claimed to value silence above all. His decision simplified cases against the men who had set the city roaring after quiet years. Merlino's trial in 2001 became a defining episode for the post-Bruno era. The counts covered racketeering, gambling, extortion, and attempted murder. He was acquitted on the most serious killing charges but convicted on racketeering counts. He received a long sentence and went away, carrying with him the image of a public figure who had tried to turn menace into swagger. The contrast with Angelo could not have been sharper. Where the old man relied on routine to hide harm, the new face had relied on charm and volume. Neither spared the city. One simply registered as a daily tax, the other as rolling headlines. With Merlino and many of his associates gone, the organization leaned on another figure with South Philadelphia roots, Joseph Lagambi. He came from an earlier generation and presented himself as old school. For a time, starting in the late 1990s and into the 2000s, he guided the remains of the family back to a slower pulse. He avoided cameras, favored steady income, and tried to bring the map closer to the one Angelo had drawn. It looked for a while like a return to something the neighborhood recognized. No weekly fireworks, no highway ambushes, no late-night drama beyond card games and whispered disputes. But the world had changed too much for any perfect return. Oversight was tougher. The press was faster. The appetite for informants in courtrooms had grown. Even the quiet seasons ended in cases, big ones in 2011 that led to trials, and mixed results in 2013 and 2014. The machine could still run. It just couldn't run unseen. The union landscape also evolved. The building trades, a key part of Angelo's old web, faced reform pushes. Elections in locals grew more competitive. Watchdogs, internal and external, grew sharper. Where a phone call might once nudge a job call, now a paper trail and a camera waited. That didn't mean the old methods vanished entirely. It meant they carried new risk. People who had once counted on labor peace as a quiet service had to choose between cleaner contracts and the bad bet of calling in favors that could turn into evidence. Atlantic City, the big hope and big problem, remained complicated. Casinos expanded and contracted in cycles, new competition appeared in neighboring states, and the economy shifted with storms and recessions. The compliance culture there, a wall of forms and interviews, hardened. What Angelo had once treated like a machine that could be fed from the edges now felt like a system designed to spot the kind of edges he had used. The space for any underworld influence grew narrower, and the risks of trying to force an opening became obvious in public filings and hearings that named names and canceled contracts. People asked during those years whether anyone could lead the organization the way Angelo had. The honest answer is that the conditions that allowed him to work as he did no longer existed. He had benefited from a time when the commission in New York acted as a brake, when national attention was less coordinated, when wiretaps were rarer and less effective, when communities were more closed, and when the press moved slower. By the 1990s and 2000s, those cushions were gone. New York's own oversight was weakened by sweeping prosecutions. Federal RICO strategy had matured. Grand juries were better staffed. Neighborhoods were more mixed. Cameras were everywhere. You couldn't rebuild the 1960s on a 1990s street, yet his name persisted in meeting rooms. Men would say, "The old man wouldn't have done it this way," to argue against a showy play or a risky grab. Others used the same sentence as a taunt, a way to mark an opponent as obsolete. In that argument, you hear the two poles of his legacy: restraint as wisdom, and restraint as a lid on ambition. Neither pole tells the whole story, because both leave out the key fact that all of it, quiet or loud, depended on taking what wasn't offered and taxing what wasn't owed. Every so often a reporter would find a neighbor who still remembered him smoothing his coat at the curb, or a shop owner who remembered a kind word after a bad month. These stories mattered because they showed how deeply his manner had imprinted on the place that raised him. They also showed how easily a city can confuse politeness with virtue. Angelo's calm was a decision, the core of a model designed to keep eyes elsewhere. It kept people safe from spectacle, and it exposed them daily to quiet costs. The 1990s, by showing what the opposite looked like. Sirens, cameras, bursts of panic made some nostalgic for the old tax. That nostalgia says as much about human nature as it does about him. If you trace the legal trail through the decade and beyond, you see how often his name appears not in counts, but in context. Prosecutors explained him to juries to show what Philadelphia's criminal structure looked like when it functioned without drama. They didn't do this to praise him. They did it to teach the architecture, to make sense of why a city slid from quiet control to jagged chaos, and to show what federal law tries to prevent: a private system that competes with public authority for the power to decide who works, who gets paid, and who gets a visit when they say no. You can also see how the city changed around the places he once touched. Some bars disappeared, replaced by cafes and restaurants owned by new families, with new languages in the kitchen and different habits at the door. Some union halls reformed or lost clout. Docks modernized, the shore diversified. Atlantic City's boom and slip changed the patterns of who traveled there for work. The systems that had once carried his stamp didn't vanish. They thinned, shifted, or moved into new corners. That is another reason his method could not be simply revived. The ground itself wasn't the same. Those who knew both eras, cousins who aged into shop ownership, drivers who aged into dispatchers, policemen who aged into retirees on a bench, summed it up in a sentence with a sigh. Under Angelo, you paid and slept. Under the war years, you paid and didn't. It's a stark line, but it captures a feeling that ran through the city. It is not a defense of the past. It is a recognition that a quiet harm wears people down differently than a loud one, and that memory tends to forgive the quieter kind first. History's job is to state both, and let them sit side by side, which is what we have tried to do. There's a final irony in the way his driver's story ended up echoing his own. Stanfa, the man who knew the old routes better than almost anyone, tried to reassert that muted discipline and found himself targeted in the most public way possible. He carried the Bruno playbook into a time when it had fewer pages left. His fall marked the end of any claim that the old method could simply be reimposed by will. After that, even the quietest seasons were marked by court dates and wiretap leaks. The spell was broken. Through all of it, the stoop remains in stories. People point down a block and say, "He used to stand there," as if the sight of a man smoothing a coat explains a lifetime. In a way, it does. He believed in small gestures that add up, in a tone that lowers voices, in days that look the same on purpose. He also believed in arrangements that bent a city's paths without its consent. Both beliefs traveled with him to the end. Both outlived him, teaching lessons to people who never met him about how order can hide harm and how noise can distract from the change that actually lasts. Walk a South Philadelphia block at dusk and listen. You hear screen doors, a radio through a cracked window, a bus catching second gear, a laugh from a stoop, a bottle clinked against another. Names rise and fall in the talk. Some are new. One keeps coming back, said the way you say a street you grew up on. He stood here, people say, with his hands folded, looking up and down like he was making sure the day ended the way it was supposed to. The city kept moving after him. It changed lanes, changed faces, changed rules. But the map he drew calm on top, currents beneath, still explains how so many days once felt the same. His story fits into a few clean lines before it spreads out again. Born as Angelo Annaloro in Villalba, Sicily. Immigrant kid in Philadelphia, learning English and streets at once. A listener more than a talker. Early ties under older bosses who valued silence. Money made where crowds already gathered. Bars, clubs, small halls, union rooms, quarters in machines. Bets written on slips. Loans given and collected with pressure. Kept off the front page. A rise to the top in 1959 after a trip to New York to ask for order, not chaos. A long run defined by routines that looked like neighborhood life while moving untaxed cash into private hands. He favored steady earnings. Numbers, sports wagers, card rooms, tucked behind doors people already used for birthdays and anniversaries. He wrapped those income streams with things that looked ordinary from the sidewalk. Vending routes, jukebox placements, cigarette machines, later amusement machines that blinked quietly in corners. He layered union influence on top dock calls, warehouse shifts, construction rosters, hotel floors, so that contracts and deliveries met fewer surprises. He kept his own voice low and trained people to handle problems before a neighbor noticed. His rule about narcotics don't bring that trade into his streets was a line he repeated often. Even if reality on the edges proved messy, the line helped keep the city's outrage from spiking and kept agents guessing. When Atlantic City voted for casinos, he treated the news like a supply list, not a trumpet. Linens, food, trash, cash transit, machine repair, loading dock order, labor peace. He placed people one step back from the lights. It was consistent with the way he had always moved. Stay close enough to feel the warmth, far enough to avoid a burn. That patience bothered men who wanted more, and it annoyed younger faces who compared their cut to stories from louder places. His answer never changed. Calm pays more than commotion. The cost of that calm was paid by others. Small businesses learned to accept machines they didn't want. Owners paid fees to avoid delays that should not have existed. Borrowers took cash at rates that trapped them. Contractors called the same consultant when they needed a shift to go smoothly. Inspectors heard from old friends about a little help. The model did not create value. It extracted it. And it bent public systems so quietly that many people called it the way things were. He excelled at turning harm into background. He stayed out of long prison terms by refusing to be interesting in public. He answered questions with courtesies. He took contempt citations rather than explain himself. He did not keep ledgers within reach of a search. He spoke in generalities so broad that a tape caught only air. Agents learned his steps, watched his car, and left with notebooks full of times and places and not enough words to go with them. That discipline, more than luck, kept him on his stoop for 2 decades. The end came when hunger met misreading. A North Jersey lieutenant, Antonio Caponegro, pressed for more freedom and more money in the new era, believed he had cover from across the river, and moved against him. The city woke to sirens on a block that had been built to do without them. Punishment followed fast for those who had acted without permission. Stability returned briefly under Philip Testa, then vanished in another blast. A new leader, Nicodemo Scarfo, stepped forward with a different style and turned down the volume knob he had inherited the wrong way. Streets that had known quiet harm learned what loud harm felt like. Trials in the 1980s and early 1990s told juries the story of those years and, by necessity, the story of his years. Prosecutors used a law that hadn't been available to earlier generations, the racketeering statute, to link illegal gambling, extortion, and loan collections into a single narrative about an enterprise with rules and rank. Witnesses talked about Thursday lunches, quiet kitchens, and a map divided into crews that matched neighborhoods people knew by heart. Charts that once lived in the heads of men who kept secrets now hung in courtrooms with lines and arrows. His name sat at the start of many explanations even when the charges named others, because the shape of the organization they described was the one he had formed. The culture around him had shifted by then in ways that made a return to his exact model unlikely. The federal witness program had changed what silence meant in court. Investigative tools were tighter and more coordinated. State commissions had learned to follow money and influence at the same time. The press moved faster. Communities were less closed, less inclined to look away out of habit or fear. Atlantic City's regulators had built high walls and expected vendors to stand up to questions without flinching. Even if someone wanted to run the 1960s playbook, the field had new lines painted on it. Neighborhood memory did something different with him. People told stories about a man who waited on a porch, asked about grandchildren, left an envelope at a fundraiser, and made a quiet word count when a bill or rent weighed heavy. Those stories are true in the small ways that stories like that are true. They leave out the second story that lived alongside them. The little businesses leaned on through suggestion, the loan conditions that narrowed futures, the envelopes that moved not as charity, but as a cost of doing business under a private system. The two memories sat shoulder to shoulder without argument, because they did not meet in the middle. History's job is to hold both at once and feel the pinch. The list of what he did is simple to write, harder to live with. He led an organization that profited from illegal gambling, from loans at rates that trapped people, from payments collected for the promise of peace, from machine routes that kept competitors out, from union influence that shifted jobs and contracts, from pressure on public decision-makers who were supposed to look only at the facts, and from quiet positions in the supply chains that fed a casino city. He kept a public line against narcotics that, whatever its full reach in practice, shaped his image and the way he managed heat. He worked with leaders in New York to keep borders and disputes under control. He lasted because he believed trouble came to those who invited it and behaved accordingly. His legacy in law and policy shows up in places that don't carry his name. Prosecutors learned to tell a full story instead of a partial one, to explain how dozens of small acts add up to a structure. Agencies learned to share files instead of working alone. Labor reformers built stronger internal checks. Regulators in gaming wrote standards for vendors and enforced them with the memory of what could happen if they didn't. Cities improved transparency around permits, inspections, and bids. Banks and lenders explored ways to reach people excluded from credit markets so that high-interest cash no longer felt like the only option. When those fixes work, they make it harder for a private tax to attach itself to ordinary life. The city changed in ways that made his old routes feel like artifacts. The Pennsylvania lottery, created in the early 1970s, gave people a legal number to pick. Legal sports wagering decades later pulled many bettors into regulated rooms and apps. Cash became plastic and then phones, a shift that starved some corner hustles of oxygen. Bars became restaurants with playlists on screens instead of jukeboxes that ate quarters. Union halls faced new competition from training pipelines and compliance demands. Docks computerized. The shore built, closed, rebuilt. Every change bent the world he once steered, sometimes on purpose, sometimes as a side effect of technology. And still, the lesson he taught about tone remains useful far beyond the world he came from. A city can be broken quietly. A budget can be bent without a shout. A promise can be rerouted by a smile and a suggestion. He understood that and turned it into a method for profit. The antidotes are as quiet as the harm they answer. Rules that are clear, processes that are visible, options that are fair, neighbors who ask questions when something feels off, and a habit inside public offices of writing things down and expecting those notes to be read. Those are not dramatic answers. They are everyday ones, which makes them strong if people keep using them. Even in the 1000, 990s and 2000s, when younger crews tried on new identities, you could hear his name used as a measuring stick. People aiming for patience said they wanted to get back to his way. People aiming for big moves said they were done with restraint. Both camps missed the part of his story that matters most now. The best reason not to chase chaos isn't that it draws heat. The best reason to keep streets quiet isn't that quiet money is safer money. The reason is that a city functions best when private pressure doesn't direct public decisions. He lowered the temperature not to protect the public good, but to protect a private scheme. That's the distinction that should stick. If you walk the path of his life in your mind, a few images linger. A boy off a ship, eyes wide in a city of row houses. A teenager in a back room, busy hands, ears open. A young husband who keeps family and business on two sides of a wall. A midlife man in a restaurant kitchen, hearing two versions of a dispute, deciding without raising his voice. An older leader smoothing his coat at the curb, confident that routines will carry another day. Those pictures help explain how a person can be polite and harmful, how a neighborhood can be generous and trapped, how a city can believe it is safe because it is quiet when, in truth, it is only quiet. He is remembered as the gentle Don because newspapers like a phrase that fits above a photo. The words turned a strategy into a personality. People took the tone and forgot the setup that produced it. He didn't keep things gentle. He kept them orderly, which for his circle meant profitable, and for the city meant burdened in ways that didn't make noise. The nickname will last. That's how legends work. It doesn't have to blind anyone to the facts. Older than any one person. And it will outlive this story unless people keep naming it as a problem when they see it. His life, told honestly, helps because it strips away excuses. He was talented, patient, and thoughtful. He built a system that hurt people by smoothing away their choices. He made those harms look like ordinary weather. We can learn to notice when the weather isn't weather. Stand again on that block at dusk. The air is softer than at noon. You can hear a pot lid click into place in a second-floor kitchen. Someone calls a kid in for the night. A bus coughs and moves on. You think of the row house where he liked to pause, the car door he opened like he had all the time in the world. The belief that if every day looked like the day before, nothing would break. He was wrong about that in the end. He was right about this much. People pay attention to what they notice, and they notice what makes a scene. The hard work is paying attention when there isn't one. The city goes on. The names change. The work of keeping public life public repeats. 1,000 small offices make 1,000 small choices. Some of those choices still tempt the old way of thinking, where a quiet suggestion can move a form to the top. The best answer is not a speech. It's a steady habit. Clear rules, real competition, fair credit, oversight that looks boring on purpose. His life is many things, but as a teacher, it is simple. You can hide a lot inside a routine. You can also protect a lot with one. If you ask people who knew him what they remember most, many will talk about that nod on the stoop, a small courtesy in a city that values them. Hold that image and let it sit beside the list of what sat behind it. The two together are the truth. The nod made a block feel safe. The work behind it made that feeling expensive. Knowing both is a way to honor a city that has learned to tell whole stories about itself, even when those stories complicate the old warmth we keep for those who wave to us on our way home. The last thing to say is the same line he carried like a rule. Go home at night. In his mouth it meant, stay low, avoid noise, keep order. In a city's mouth, it can mean something better. Go home because the day ran on open paths. Go home because a license was granted or denied by the book, not by a whisper. Go home because a contract went to the best bid, not the best connection. Go home because a loan came from a bank with a fair rate, not a back room with a calendar. If a city can say that, the calm on its blocks will be honest. And the quiet a person hears at dusk won't cover anything that needs to be uncovered. It will just be the sound of people living without a second system tugging at the edges. That, finally, is where his story leaves us, with a choice about which kind of quiet we want.